Welcome to the Fear and Greed Business Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. The local share market is finishing 2023 strong, although the rest of the year wasn't quite so impressive. With the help of this late rally, the S&P/ASX 200 will end the year probably up around 5% thereabouts. It's been a good 12 months for the tech stocks and some consumer discretionary companies, not so much for the energy sector. Let's take a look at some of the big winners and some of the big losers. Remember, this information is general in nature and you should always seek professional advice before making any investment decisions. Steve Daglian is a market analyst at CommSec. Steve, welcome back to Fear and Greed.
Thanks for having me back, Sean.
Hard not to start with the tech stocks. Let's start there. What do you think? Just describe what happened in the last 12 months.
Absolutely. It's been just a crazy and very interesting year for markets, very broadly speaking, but the tech stocks have certainly been some of the best performers, not only locally, but also globally in many ways. And it's really one of the key reasons why our market has underperformed, say, the US market, because, the Aussie share market only accounts about 2% of the Aussie share market is made up of tech stocks. Over in the United States, it's about a third of its market. And that's why, we're still doing very well, but hasn't had that much to do with tech stocks locally, but certainly played a very big part over in the United States. And I look back at this, looked at a few stocks in particular. And speaking in the US firstly, Apple is up about 50% year to date. And it is easily the biggest stock in the US. It has a market cap of about $3 trillion US dollars. That's significantly larger than our entire Australian share market. So when it's doing so well, that's been a key reason why one of the reasons anyway, why the American market has also managed to stand out much more than what we've seen here locally.
Okay, the local tech stocks, REA, Xero, Car, as in the old carsales.com, I think they're all top 25 of the top 200 anyway. They've actually done really well. They haven't had that artificial intelligence boost that a lot of those Wall Street stocks have had, but they've still done pretty well.
They certainly have. I mean, tech stock as a group, they're up roughly that 29 to 30% mark. And second best, we've got consumer discretionary stocks that are up around 17%. So they're certainly nowhere near. You're right, though, across the board. I mean, there have been some very strong performers in that tech space, which have managed to stand out. The likes of Xero, for example, the accounting software group. It's had a bit of a mixed year overall, but it's, still up about 60% year to date, which is solid. I mean, WiseTech's up 45%. So we are seeing some solid improvements. REA, which you mentioned, it's up 58%. So some really significant improvements coming through from some of the heavyweights in that space. Broadly speaking, if you'd like to discuss that at all, we can also touch on what some of the drivers have been on the Australian share market in the US as well, and how that's translated potentially to some improvements in that tech space.
Yeah, so I mean, sort of there's the tech guys, but then the next, you mentioned consumer discretionary have done well. The real estate investment trusts have done well. Some of these interest rate sensitive sectors. Tell us about that.
Absolutely. So this year, if we had to narrow it down to a few drivers, I mean, there's been so much information that has been driving the global share market in 2023 from, the war in the Middle East, the war in Ukraine, the US banking crisis, which is kind of ancient history now. And it's hard to believe that was actually this year that we had, a number of US banks going under. It seemed like it wasn't going to be a great year, but we've had such a strong finish. Inflation and interest rates. I mean, it's getting kind of boring talking about this, but they remain two key drivers of global markets. I mean, we had 13 interest rate hikes in Australia since the RBA started lifting back in May 2022, which is a lot, of course, but our cash rate is significantly lower to many other countries. I mean, we're at 4.35%, and even though 18 months ago we're at 0.1%, it's still a pretty big jump. Europe's at 4.5%, Canada's at 5%, over 5% in the UK and the US, 22-year high rates in New Zealand as well. What's happened in the last month or two is we've had tremendous improvements, and it's partly because there's been a little bit of excitement around that maybe the worst of the rate hikes are behind us, and if anything, maybe the next move is going to be down for many central banks. So that's created some excitement. When that's going to happen, still is going to depend, I guess, on a few key things that we get released in coming months, but that certainly has been a key catalyst, and that's created a huge amount of excitement. No more rate hikes and potential rate cuts next year. That's the type of thing that has really helped some of those interest rate sensitive areas. So you're right, tech has been top of the bunch there. Consumer discretionary right there as well. Property stocks, up about 10% over the course of the year. And financials as well have done, reasonably well as a group. Many of the banks can benefit from higher interest rates, but it gets to a point sometimes where it's no longer beneficial. So, many of these areas have been some of the standouts. And on the losers end, energy stocks, consumer staples, utilities. Utilities is the smallest sector of the Aussie share market. It's basically made up of just 3 stocks on the ASX 200. So gains across the board, but you're right, interest rate sensitive stocks kind of right at the top of the list.
Stay with me, Steve. We'll be back in a minute. My guest this morning is CommSec market analyst Steve Daglian. How do we think about banks? Because I always get confused with banks because I always thought rising interest rates would be good for banks, but then competition is so fierce, particularly in the mortgage lending market, which is a big driver of earnings for banks. How have they performed over the past 12 months and what have been the drivers there? Have their profit margins improved?
Yeah, so that's the interesting thing with the banks, because when interest rates are rising, it can actually help margins. We haven't really seen that in recent times. Have come under a little bit more pressure. But if we look at the sector or some of the key stocks overall, we've still seen CBA shares lifting 8% higher, NAB up in the order of 1.5%, ANZ up 8%. We've got Macquarie up about 10%. So some reasonable gains. It's a more challenging environment still, you're right, in the fact that there's a bit more pressure, I guess, on many mortgage holders, home loans, and also, of course, we're at that point now where we're not 100% sure what the Reserve Bank will do with rates. We still think that it's more likely than not that the next move is going to be down by the RBA, but it can kind of get to the point where higher rates are no longer helpful for profit margins for many of the financials.
Hard to talk about the ASX 200 without mentioning the miners. The diversified miners haven't had such a good run, South32 being an example of that, whereas the iron ore guys, especially Fortescue, they've had a great year. Is it all about commodity prices with that sector?
It makes a huge difference, absolutely. China's been the big talking point, or one of them, in addition to inflation and interest rates. The focus has been on a slowing Chinese economy, which just hasn't bounced back as fast as hoped from the COVID lockdowns. Data out of China has been very disappointing, and it's highlighting a lack of demand. And one of the key reasons why this is important, of course, is that China buys a third of Australia's exports, half the world's commodities, 70 to 75% of iron ore supply, and about 15% of the world's oil as well. So it is the key driver of things. There has been quite a different story to be told for different commodities, though. Lithium prices have really come under pressure, and that's been reflected in how some of those lithium producers have performed. One of the worst performers this whole year has been Core Lithium, which is down about 69%. Sayona Mining is also under a bit of pressure. But you're right, as far as iron ore is concerned, it has been very resilient. We've got iron ore prices up around that $135 per tonne mark, even though China's not doing so well, a bit of a supply issue there. So we've seen very strong improvements coming through from a few of our big miners, BHP, Rio, Fortescue, not too long ago hit a record high. And those 3 stocks alone, BHP, Rio and Fortescue, make up about 14% of our market. So when you get some strong improvements coming through from them in the last couple of months, which is exactly what we've seen, that really is supportive for the ASX 200 and the broader indexes as well.
I just want to touch on healthcare as well, because we have plenty of healthcare stocks. We don't tend to talk about them as much on Fear and Greed, but Cochlear, for example, has had an excellent year. CSL's had a much more wonky year, obviously the market leader in terms of health stocks on the ASX 200. That's on the back of fears about earnings and things like that. But how's the healthcare sector done generally?
It's been mixed, and you're exactly right. If we look at the performance of the ASX 200 healthcare index, it's up 0.6%, roughly.
Right.
So it's improved by less than 1%. So it's underperforming the broader market. Exactly right. We'll wait and see how it ends. And really, you're right. CSL is the big driver here. So it's by far and away the biggest stock there. It's down about 1.5% in 2023. If we look at a stock like Cochlear, it's up 47% this year, a very different story. And others like Sonic Healthcare up 5%. So a mixed bag, but really if there's one stock that is the key driver of that whole index, it's CSL. So whatever it does, if it's doing well as far as plasma collections are concerned, then it can certainly receive a bit of a boost. But it's been through a more challenging period for quite some time. It's down 1.5% roughly this year. It fell 1% last year as well, and it rose about 2% over the prior 2 years.
Okay, Steve Daglian from CommSec, let's wrap it up. The big drivers of the market in 2023, the real key trends that you've seen.
Yeah, so if we had to narrow it down, there were a few things that happened. Inflation, interest rates, they were the two key drivers. And as we said, 13 rate hikes is a lot, but really the fact that markets are excited a bit that could be the end of rate hikes has been very helpful. The slowing Chinese economy has been another. Late in the year, the key catalyst was signs that inflation slowing, growing hopes that central banks are done. And we've had economic data that generally has been a bit underwhelming. Economic growth in Australia disappointed in December, stalling over the September quarter. In fact, we had the slowest quarterly growth in 2 years. And labour market data has been mixed. So we've had, on one hand, a strong lift in jobs growth. Most of the job gains in the last 3, 4, 5 months have been part-time positions rather than full-time. But also we've had unemployment rising to 3.9%. Now that's still low, but it's the highest it's been since interest rates started to be increased back in May 2022. And also, with strong migration and fewer jobs being advertised, that's the perfect recipe, I guess, for the jobless rate to lift further. So that's something to consider. As far as big picture in the ASX 200, there are a few things to consider with how the market has moved, because between August and October, our market fell 8.5%. We hit a 12-month low in late October as well. And since that point, our share market went on an 11% rally. We're at 10-month highs, up around 7% year to date. And that's not only enough to recoup last year's declines, but we've been so close to getting to record highs as well. So it's been a real rocky ride. It hasn't been smooth sailing at all, but we've had a very strong month. And I guess, Santa has arrived early, and we'll see if he hangs around for the rest of the year.
Let's hope so. Steve, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
My pleasure.
That was CommSec market analyst Steve Daglian. This is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. Remember, this information is general in nature and you should seek professional advice before making any investment decisions. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, Australia's most popular business podcast. I'm Sean Aylmer. Have a great day.